So what happens if a social worker gets their clinical experience in an exempt setting? Is that going to be acceptable, David, for licensing?
Well, the biggest issue that we've found is that an individual has to complete their experience legally, which the exempt setting could allow that to happen. They also, though, have to be under a qualified supervisor, and they have to be engaged in psychotherapy, diagnosis, and assessment-based treatment planning for 2,000 hours over 3 years with 100 hours of supervision. What we've found is that in some of these exempt agencies, the individuals who are assigned to supervise might not meet the requirements in the education law for being an LCSW, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist. For instance, in a lot of substance abuse programs, there are people who have an MSW degree and a CASAC credential, which qualifies them to provide services in that program, but don't qualify as a supervisor under the licensing law. So the individual can think that they're getting the experience, but it's not going to be acceptable because we can't accept an unqualified supervisor. So what we have done is create what we call the Form 6, and it provides an individual, whether they're in an exempt setting or not, to submit that with their supervisor, with the copy of their supervisor's license, and with information about the setting so that we can look at that, and then we can come back to that applicant and say, or that LMSW, and say, this setting is approved, this supervisor is qualified, so this would be acceptable experience for you to complete. It's then up to the supervisor to make sure that the person meets those requirements. If there's a problem with the supervisor, if there's a problem with the setting, we also tell the individual so they can work for an alternative supervisor or for a position in a different setting where they can get the experience that they want to get licensed as a clinical social worker.
Okay. All right. Now, another issue that tends to come up, and something that's not widely understood, is that since one needs to be an LMSW to meet the experience requirements for the LCSW, and then they may, apply and get approved to be an LCSW, at that time they will technically have 2 licenses. So what should people do?
There are some individuals who might want to hold 2 licenses for one reason or another, but most people will not. So once an individual is licensed as an LCSW, they will receive at some point a renewal notice for their LMSW license. They can wait until they get that renewal notice, or anytime before that they can contact the Office of the Professions and ask to make that LMSW inactive. There's no charge to go inactive, and as long as your license is inactive and you're not using that title, you're not practicing that profession, you don't have to pay any registration fee to us, because the LCSW's scope encompasses LMSW, so they can use just that one license to provide all the services that they're competent to perform within the scope of practice.
Okay, great. Another issue is continuing education, Karen. Once you're licensed, are there requirements to complete continuing education in order to maintain your license?
There is actually no requirement in New York State for continuing education credits. We're one of the only states that doesn't actually have this. However, there's a variety of ways that you can increase your skills and capabilities through both our office and other providers that allow for continuing education courses.
And it's still, people are ethically obligated and legally obligated to practice within their scope of competence, and
Absolutely.
That is a way to develop that. And frequently asked question is about grandparenting. Are there any ways to get grandparented as an LMSW or an LCSW today or moving forward?
No, there was a grandparenting period between September 1st of 2004 to August 31st, 2005. That train has left the station. There are no other available options to become grandparented.
So people have to pass the exam
Yes.
in order to get licensed at either level. Okay. One last question. If I'm licensed as an LCSW, do I need to get the R privilege to have a private practice?
That's a good question, and the answer, like so many times, it sort of depends on the situation of the individual. Once you are licensed as a clinical social worker, if you are competent to provide psychotherapy, The law allows you to set up a practice to provide psychotherapy, to engage in diagnosis, to provide clinical social work services as those are defined in the law, without meeting any other requirements. However, and many insurance plans might reimburse an individual who has the LCSW, because in the language of the insurers, that's the independent clinical license, and that's what they tend to look for. So the R's, so an individual really doesn't need to meet any other requirements to practice psychotherapy. But however, New York insurance law and the licensing law for many years have provided what's called the R privilege. And that's an additional 3 years of post-LCSW supervised experience in doing psychotherapy and diagnosis. An individual can apply for this by submitting to the department what we call Form 1 Social Work Privilege, SWPR, and a $100 fee, along with a Form 6 SWPR, where they and their supervisor present a plan for how that LCSW is going to complete supervised experience toward that privilege. That plan should spell out that the individual is going to get supervision, individual or group supervision from the supervisor, or the individual could enroll in one of the psychotherapy institutes that are prevalent in New York, particularly in the downstate region, where they get additional education as well as the opportunity to provide services under the supervision of a qualified supervisor. When they complete those 3 years of experience, our 2,400 client clock hours, the supervisor submits verification to us, and then we can issue the R privilege, which goes as part of their license registration. It doesn't go with their license certificate or parchment, and once you receive the R, there's no requirement that you complete any additional training. It is used by some insurance companies to designate individuals who are qualified for reimbursement, because that ties to the language in the insurance law. We know that there are insurers, though, who don't require the R, and so an individual might want to check about insurance coverage or other reimbursement before they start going down the road toward the R, because it's not something that every LCSW will need as part of their license.
Okay. And just a follow-up, what is a qualified supervisor for someone working towards their R?
The qualified supervisor for someone working toward the R include a licensed psychologist, a licensed physician who is a psychiatrist, and an individual who's a licensed clinical social worker who has the R themselves. In previous years, we allowed peers to sort of supervise each other and realized that was not really, one, an effective way to get supervision, and two, was not consistent with the insurance law. So that was one of the changes made in 2010 in the regulations to clarify that an LCSW could not supervise another LCSW for the R. It has to be an LCSW with the R, the psychologist or the psychiatrist.
Okay. Well, wow, we've covered a lot of ground, but if someone still has questions about licensure and practice, where can they get more information?
As should have become obvious during our discussions, the licensing laws and regulations are very complex in New York, and individuals are invited to go to our website, www.op.nysed.gov. In there they get access to the education law. They can look up the profession of social work and find the laws, the rules, the regulations. They can find practice guidelines, recommendations for things that you should do and things that you should not do in the practice of the profession. We have implemented a software technology so that there's a Find Answers tab on our website that organizes about 1,400 questions and answers from things about licensure and practice, waivers that are available to certain corporations that want to employ social workers within a not-for-profit setting, discipline, all of that other type of information is all there for the asking on the website.
Okay, fabulous. We really feel strongly that it's critical that social work professionals and students really take the time to understand what it means to engage in licensed social work practice. We hope that we've provided you with some valuable information, and I'd like to give special thanks to my guests, Karen Moran and David Hamilton, and thank you for taking the time to join us.